Now, and there are ways we could, in fact, discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now, you have to keep putting pressure on bad ideas, because that's the thing about bad ideas. They don't respond well to pressure. People have internal contradictions in their lives that they can notice because they're, do you think prayer works? Many people say yes, absolutely, I think prayer works. And then you say, okay, well, we have a new airline where the pilots are just going to rely on prayer to land the planes. Tickets will be cheap, and you can sign up. Who's going to sign up for that airline? If the pilot comes over the PA system and tells you that he's convinced that prayer is all he needs to land this plane, you're just going to see just stark terror on the faces of even the most religious people, and so that's a contradiction that can be pointed out. And we have to do that 1,000-fold and just keep doing it. But as you say, global warming, evolution, these are the jury's not out on questions, and many people just don't subscribe, and it's a failure of conversation ultimately.
I write books about what's going on in the Muslim world because I have an expertise in what's going on in the Muslim world. I actually travel through the Muslim world. I study the Muslim world. I understand the conversations that are taking place. And so I feel like, in a sense, I'm in a better position to sort of make judgments about what sort of socio or religious or political developments are taking place within this people of 1.5 billion number. Statements like there are millions of Muslims who have this sort of death cult are profoundly inaccurate and are based on nothing except your sort of general impression of a region and of a religion that you have a very surface understanding of.
Well, it's not. For instance, in the End of Faith, I cite these Pew polls that were done in 9 Muslim countries, actually not the most radicalized. I mean, the most radicalized countries wouldn't let the polling be done. But even in Turkey, the Muslim success story on many fronts, the level of support for suicide bombing against non-combatants in defense of the faith was shocking. I mean, you just run the numbers. When 77% of people in Lebanon say that it is justified, that's, it's not a minority. It's not even close to a minority. Even if it were only 5% of the Muslim world that was radicalized by my lights, that is still a problem we have to talk about soberly. I mean, we're talking about 75 million people.
Certainly, and I don't think anybody would say that that's not a conversation that we need to talk about. But it's a civilizational problem that is not amenable to simply saying that Islam is a religion of peace. I don't understand what Islamic civilization means. I mean, I don't.
I'm talking about this global civilization.
Oh, I see. I think, look,
I'm curious, how many of you consider yourselves to be devout Muslims? I see a show of hands. Don't mean to single anyone out, but not many. Now, you're all aware, of course, that the Quran exists and claims to be the perfect word of the creator of the universe. You're aware that once having heard of this possibility and rejecting it, you're all going to hell. for eternity. I mean, needless to say, Dr. Craig and I are both going to hell if this vision of life is true. Okay, the problem is that everything Dr. Craig has said tonight, with a few modifications, could be said in defense of Islam. In fact, has been said in defense of Islam. Okay, the logic is exactly the same. We have a book that claims to be the word of the creator of the universe. It tells us about the nature of moral reality and how to live within it. But what if Muslims are right? And what if Islam is true? Okay, how should we view God in moral terms? How would we view God in moral terms? Or I should say Allah. Okay, we have been born in the wrong place, to the wrong parents, given the wrong culture, given the wrong theology. Okay, needless to say, Dr. Craig is doomed. He's been thoroughly confused by Christianity. I mean, just appreciate what a bad position he's now in to appreciate the true Word of God. I've been thoroughly misled by science. Okay, where is Allah's compassion? Okay. And yet, he's omnipotent. He could change this in an instant. He could give us a sign that would convince everyone in this room. And yet he's not going to do it. And hell awaits. And hell awaits our children because we can't help but mislead our children. Okay, now just hold this vision in mind. And first appreciate how little sleep you have lost over this possibility. Okay? Just feel in yourself at this moment how carefree you are and will continue to be in the face of this possibility. What are the chances that we're all going to go to hell for eternity because we haven't recognized the Quran to be the perfect word of the creator of the universe? Please know that this is exactly how Christianity appears to someone who's not been indoctrinated by it. Perfectly clear to me that my style of conversation is not what can be broadcast to the Muslim world to change people's minds. I mean, that is your job. You are much better suited for that job. And I would agree with you that in order to empower the moderates of the Muslim world, drawing cartoons of the Prophet and writing paragraphs of the sort I've written is not a strategy. I'm not a diplomat. And I don't know, but what's troubling me is I don't know where the line is between encouraging moderation, representing what Islam could be. You know, Islam could be a religion of peace, perhaps. Jihad could be just an inner spiritual struggle and have nothing to do with holy war. Indeed, that we have to raise a generation of Muslims who believe those things. But pretending that it is already is problematic, because it isn't for so many millions of Muslims. And it may be that if you pretend hard enough, in fact, you become what you pretend to be. And maybe that's part of the process. But I think we have to admit to ourselves that we are confronting the behavior of a death cult among millions and millions of Muslims, not 10,000 who went to training camps in Afghanistan. We are confronting an endorsement of this kind of behavior and a reflexive political solidarity where Muslims side with other Muslims, no matter how sociopathic their behavior, simply because they're other Muslims. We can't deny the problem while trying to encourage a more benign face of the religion. Another problem with calling ourselves atheists is that every religious person thinks he has a knockdown argument against atheism. And we've all heard these arguments, and we are going to keep hearing them as long as we call ourselves atheists. We've all heard the argument that the atheist can't prove there is no God. Or as Rick Warren put it when I debated him for Newsweek, a rational person like him doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because the idea that the universe could be created without a creator is the most extravagant faith claim of all. Now, as Richard just pointed out, these arguments are travesties if they're used to defend any specific conception of God. And we all know what to do in this situation. We have Russell's teapot, we have the thousands of dead gods, and now we have a flying spaghetti monster, the non-existence of which can't be proven, and yet the existence of which is, a belief in which is acknowledged to be ridiculous by anyone. The problem is we have to keep having the same argument over and over again. So too with the greatest crimes of the 20th century argument. How many times are we going to have to counter the charge that Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot represent the end game of atheism? Now, I got news for you. This meme is not going away. I argued against it in The End of Faith, and it was immediately thrown up at me in reviews of the book as though I had never mentioned it. So I mentioned it again in the afterword to the paperback of The End of Faith, and this did no good whatsoever. So then I brought it up again. At the risk of boring all of you, I brought it up again in Letter to a Christian Nation. And Richard did the same in The God Delusion. And Christopher took a mighty whack at it in God is Not Great. I think this argument will be with us for as long as we call ourselves atheists. And it really convinces people. It really convinces liberals and moderates. It even convinces the occasional atheist. Why should we stand obediently in the space provided? Why should we stand in the space carved out by the conceptual scheme of theistic religion? I mean, it's as though our opponents, before any debate, have drawn the chalk outline of a dead man on the sidewalk, and we just walk up and lie down in it. Instead of doing this, think about what would happen if we simply use words like reason and evidence. Now, what is the argument against reason? It's true that certain people will bite the bullet here and say that reason is itself a problem and the Enlightenment is a failed project, but the truth is, very few people are comfortable admitting to being enemies of reason. Even among fundamentalists, I would say especially among fundamentalists. They imagine themselves to be champions of reason. They think they have very good reasons for believing in God. Nobody wants to believe things on bad evidence. The desire to know what is actually going on in the world is very difficult to argue with. And insofar as we represent merely that desire, we become difficult to argue with. And this desire is not reducible to an interest group. It's not a club, and it's not an affiliation. And I think trying to make it one, or giving the appearance that it is one, necessarily diminishes its power. I think that the issue of belief is that I don't see religious belief as distinct from any other kinds of beliefs. I mean, we represent the world in our thoughts, and all of us are in the business of hoping that our representations are accurate, or at least accurate enough so that we can successfully negotiate our lives happily. I mean, nobody wants to be mistaken, profoundly mistaken about their place in the world, or about what happens after death, or where their loved ones go after. I mean, we're not in the business of deceiving ourselves just willfully. And so religious beliefs are on all fours with all of our other beliefs. We are describing the world. We're trading in these descriptions through language. Someone says to you, well, do you realize that Jesus is your personal Savior, and nobody, He's the way and the truth and the life, and nobody gets to heaven but through Him? That is a description of the way this universe is organized in moral terms and in spiritual terms, and it's either right or wrong, and it purports to be right, and it promises terrible consequences to those who don't accept it. Now, this is a very strange scheme, I think, to believe in. I mean, I'm not the first person to point out that it's a very strange sort of loving God who would have salvation depend on a person's ability to believe in Him for bad reasons. I mean, it's a weird scenario, but it's a scenario that is many people find emotionally consoling. And this another aspect here is that reason and belief are not easily separated from emotion. I mean, our rational lives are deeply entangled with our emotional lives, and we feel emotional responses to things we find to be unreasonable. I mean, I happen to think that doubt is on a continuum with disgust and other psychological rejection states. And so when we doubt a proposition, we are having an emotional response to it. And so I think we just have to be. I think there's an all-purpose corrective here, which is just intellectual honesty. I mean, if you cease to pretend to be certain about things you're not certain about, see where that gets you. See where that gets you in conversation with other human beings. I think it'll get you a profoundly ethical life. It'll certainly get you a profoundly non
deceptive life.
Which leads me to one other quick follow-up
Yeah.
question. When you say being intellectually honest and admitting you don't know these things, you said there were 3 ways to look at religion. 1, that it's true. 2nd, that it's useful.
Yeah.
And 3rd, that you're an atheist and that is a religion. But there's a 4th thing, and that could be that you're an agnostic. You don't know whether it's true or not.
Yeah, but I don't meet too many agnostics about Zeus. You know, all these agnostics about the God of Abraham should also be agnostic about Zeus. I mean, that's the same scenario.
If the poorest, most molested people were, by and large, the jihadists, and the engineers and the architects and the doctors, people who had a benefit of the good life, were disproportionately moderate, then this analysis of yours would make some sense. But we have someone like Ayman al-Zawahiri, right? A surgeon. He comes from one of the most respected families in Egypt. He's got doctors and judges and pharmacists as far as the eye can see. He is not an exception. He is not. If you correct for literacy in the Muslim world, support for suicide bombing goes up. I mean, this is the most radicalized people are not the people who, in particular, you can see this in microcosm when you actually look at the biographies of the 19 hijackers. These were all college educated. Many of them had PhDs. I mean, it's just not religion really is separable as the most important variable. And what is actually right on the surface to be seen is that these people are telling us what is motivating them. The jihadis are talking all day long about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise, the horrors of living in proximity with the infidels, the desecration of the Muslim holy sites by the proximity of infidel troops on the ground. I mean, this is, Osama bin Laden tells us what motivates him. He's telling us why he's not living in Paris and dating models with his inheritance. I mean, he is being quite articulate ad nauseum. And so to deny the role that religion is playing, I would never for a moment say that there are not poor, mistreated people driven to extremis and to extreme violence for reasons other than religion. Of course, that happens. But this is a separable component which we have rendered, by the terms of our discourse, by our emotional attachment to it, immune to criticism. It is taboo to say that the Quran is bogus as a document that describes the history of the evolution of our species, as a document that makes really cogent prescriptions about how to live in the 21st century, as is the Bible. Almost entirely bogus if you're going to take it as a text to live by. It is taboo to say that. You could not possibly get elected in this country if you even openly doubted whether or not there was a creator God listening to the prayers of your constituents. I mean, this is the world we are living in, and it's
Sam,
The ancient philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote in his Pensées, "The heart has reason in which reason does not know. We know this in countless ways." What would you say to people who try to lead a good and just life by through their religion and by following what is in their hearts, rather than following the literal sayings of the Bible and following reasoning?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't mean to diminish experience that has nothing to do with coming to a rational understanding of the way the world works. I mean, much of our experience is not a matter of reason. It's not a matter of belief even, and some of the most important aspects of our experience aren't. So experiencing love and devotion and awe, I mean, these are features of our subjectivity that I think are extraordinarily valuable. The important thing to recognize is that if you think the only real container, the only viable container for those experiences is your denominational church, is the language of your ancestors, if you're still committed to being a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, I think you are tacitly supporting the religious divisions in our world. I mean, you are giving cover, I think, quite explicitly to all of the people who take their holy books far more seriously. I mean, I can't tell you how much time I and other people have spent having to fight the battle against the liberals and moderate Christians and Jews and Muslims who will insist upon the viability of these denominations and of raising their children to think that they're Christians and Muslims and Jews, and who will never admit that any of the extremist behavior going on in the name of their faith has anything to do with religion. And so there's no question in my mind that it provides a kind of friction in our discourse where we really can't call a spade and say, okay, this is much of the Bible and the Quran is just life-destroying gibberish, and we just have to acknowledge this and cease to take these books seriously.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, right, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces. You can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now, David? And I think a much more important point is, if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books is I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
Atheism is really a term we do not need. I mean, in the same way that we don't have a word for someone who's not an astrologer. We don't have websites for non-astrologers. There are no groups for non-astrologers. Nobody wakes up in the morning feeling the need to remind himself that he's not an astrologer. The irony is that atheism is completely without content. It is not a philosophical position. And all religious people are atheists with respect to everyone else's religion. I mean, we're all atheists with respect to the thousands of dead gods who lie in that mass grave we call mythology. I mean, think of Thor and Isis and Zeus. These were once gods in good standing among our ancestors. But more importantly, every Christian rejects the claims of Islam, just as I do. Muslims claim that they have the perfect word of the creator of the universe. Why do they believe this? Because it says so in the book. Sorry, not good enough. So this term atheism really is misleading. We're talking about specific truth claims and their evidence, or lack thereof. The atheist is simply saying, as Carl Sagan did, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If ever there were an antidote to dogmatism, this is it.
Because religion is a path to God.
What are you calling God?
What am I calling God?
Where is God?
God is the intangible creator of the universe, in whose presence a human being can live, and according to whose dictates or will a human being can live in this world.
But what is your evidence for the existence of God right now?
I don't have evidence because it's not a scientific claim.
Okay, but unless you want to say,
oh, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I don't have proof because it's not a scientific claim. If you want a supporting idea, I would say my understanding of other human beings and my experience of other human beings, which leads me to believe that there's something more than material. My understanding of the design of the world, which leads me to believe that we're here not by accident. My appreciation of the fact that human beings, even though we are made of stuff, have consciousness, which leads philosophers like Galen Strawson to assume that even rudimentary material has consciousness because he can't explain how consciousness arises. Right. My experience of religious human beings and the way they live and the fact that they live in harmony, to my perception, with an invisible order that gives them a life of a certain sanctity and holiness.
This is a general claim. Religious human beings generally live in harmony with...
No, I said my experience of certain human beings. I mean, I can keep going if you want me to keep going.
Well, no, I think you've put enough on the table.
Okay, none of those are scientific evidence.
Many of those claims trespass upon the territory of science overtly. I mean, the claim about your understanding other human beings being suggestive of a divine artificer.
Is that a scientific claim?
Absolutely. I mean, is your understanding of mathematics also suggestive of a divine artificer?
No, it has to do with my experience.
Your ability to learn language?
Do you understand? It has to do with my experience of you. When I'm looking at you right now, you may assume that what I see is a material, but that's not what I see. And it's not what I believe. And I think
I understand it's not what you believe.
There's something in you that is more than you believe. I really think so.
This is
now, if you want to make that a scientific claim, you can. But I'm telling you, it's a metaphysical claim, and to confuse the two is a mistake.
Okay, you can add any metaphysics you want.
Thank you.
In that, by that means, I mean, I can say, I see you as a reincarnate personality, and I think you were probably
I was someone famous
on Atlantis.
Yes. Don't make me like a washerwoman in a previous
people do this all the time. I mean, you can broadcast. I mean, this is constrained by our common sense in every other domain of discourse. I mean, just take, for example, the people who think Elvis is still alive. Okay, what's wrong with this claim? I mean, why is this claim not vitiating our academic departments and corporations? I mean, I'll tell you why, and it's very simple. We have not passed laws against believing Elvis is still alive. The problem is that whenever somebody seriously represents his belief that Elvis is still alive in a conversation, on a first date, at a lecture, at a job interview, he immediately pays a price. He pays a price in ill-concealed laughter.
Right. Now, surely you can agree with him on that.
That is a good thing. Now, then he could rattle on about, this is not a scientific claim, this is a matter of faith. You know, when I look at you, I see you might be Elvis. I mean, he could do this.
Except that
ethos and without much practical application of compassion. So I'm still arguing for theological consequences of ideas, and I just think that there's an obscurantism at the heart of the way you're talking about this that troubles me, because this is what I think. If the Quran was exactly the way it is, but it contained a single extra line, and that line read, if you see a red-haired woman on your doorstep at sunset, cut her head off. Okay, just imagine a text like this that comes down through the ages that contains a line like that. I can tell you what kind of world we would live in. We would live in a world where red-haired women would be found murdered in the Muslim world. We would, we'd open the New York Times and we would hear that there were, 20 heads found in a bag, and they were all red-haired women. We would also live in a world in which apologists for Islam would look at that behavior and say, that has nothing to do with Islam. There was a news story yesterday about a Mormon man who killed his wife, and she had red hair. Many of those women who were found whose heads were found in the bag in Baghdad were not actually redheads, but some were strawberry blonde. We would hear about women who were shot and not decapitated, and decapitation is the only thing that is sanctioned in the Quran. I mean, this is the kind of gymnastics we would be faced with. And the basic fact about the Quran, as it is with so many other books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and There's nothing worse than Leviticus and Deuteronomy as far as I can tell, but people ignore them, as Richard pointed out. The basic problem with the Quran is that it really does preach hatred and fear of the infidel far more eloquently than it preaches anything else. And that is a problem we are living with, and no amount of casuistry is going. I'm going to briefly remind you of some of the reasons why religion can't be the repository of our moral wisdom generally. One is that when we go to Scripture, we're the guarantors of the wisdom we find there. We find the golden rule, and we say, aha, that's why you should read the Bible. Okay, that's just about the wisest thing ever said. But then we includes fundamentalists and Orthodox Jews, we ignore the rest of the book. We ignore the places in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and 2 Samuel where the most mind-numbing theocratic barbarism is recommended. So we bowdlerize the book. So clearly our moral tools are coming from outside the text. There's also the fact that there's obvious contradictions between the world's faiths. And this is a map of world religion. This is an example I've taken from my colleague Richard Dawkins. This is not how knowledge spreads over the face of the earth. I mean, there's no reason, if you're in the business of understanding truths of any kind, truths about human well-being, truths about the universe, you wouldn't expect your belief system to hug national boundaries in this way. And no one, I think, if you just imagine India, is it possible that they believe, the billion Hindus in India at the moment, that they alone, among all the world's people, well, they could probably build me a better remote, there's no doubt about that. Do they even think that they know that Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, exists and must be worshipped? I mean, this is not the way we're discovering things about the nature of the world. The people are accidentally born into the right belief system by dint of geography. Now, apart from the contradictions between faiths, there are impressive patterns of contradiction within every faith. Each one of these red arcs is linking two verses in the Bible that are just deal breakers for omniscience. I mean, these are statements that the Bible is just self-refuting in hundreds of places. Jesus was crucified the day before the Passover meal. Jesus was crucified the day after the Passover meal. You just cannot make sense of these two claims. There's also the inconvenient fact that the most important and easily resolved moral conundrums